I have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker. Mary Woolley is president of ResearchAmerica. Now, you should all know about ResearchAmerica because ResearchAmerica is the nation's largest not-for-profit, membership-supported, grassroots public education and advocacy organization committed to making medical research a higher national priority. And we all believe in that, right? Yay. Now, she's been in this role since 1990, and she is like the go-to voice for advocating for medical research. And she is going to teach us a lot tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about her. After receiving her bachelor's from Stanford and a master's from San Francisco State, she was a researcher. And she was the project director of the Mr. Fit study. I don't know if you're going to mention it, but at the time it was the largest U.S. clinical trial. So she then led the Medical Research Institute of San Francisco, first as an administrator and then as CEO. And Mary is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, previously known as the Institute of Medicine, something which you all may aspire to and be influenced by her. She serves on many boards. She's received numerous honors. They're all described in the bio that's in your booklet, including the fact that she holds honorary degrees from Northeastern Ohio Medical School, NeoMed, and from Wayne State University. But I just want on the record that from my point of view, the most important thing is that Mary is a dear friend, a mentor who has taught me so much, and she is an inspiration to many, many people, and I know you will find her inspirational tonight. So Mary, welcome. We look forward to hearing your comments about how to win hearts and minds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's a real pleasure to be here. And that you invited me makes it all the more special. So I'm hoping that something in the many things I'm going to say today will help inspire you as current and future leaders of research to add an advocacy skill set, a communications and public engagement skill set to the skills you already have or are developing as a scientist. I think that's where the power is for the future of science broadly in this country and for medical and health research in particular. It's empowering the people who do science to talk about it passionately, effectively, and visibly. So ResearchAmerica thinks about our mission as being one of advocacy, changing hearts and minds, being persuasive, passionate, not afraid of that, passion and persuasion, and making public outreach, ultimately, the new normal, the thing that everybody does if they're in the sciences. We're a long way from that right now, but I see lots of signs over the last few years that the culture is beginning to change. And it's young people, people like you scholars, who are driving that change. So don't stop now. And don't outsource it. Don't let somebody else do it for you. Make it part of your skill set. There are other people in this room who are committed to advocacy, and one of them is Claire, whose voice is heard in many places, including in this town, inside the Beltway, with the Beltway media that, frankly, nobody outside the Beltway ever need pay any attention to, but which decision makers in this town, in DC, and their staff pay incredible amount of attention to. So Claire's voice is being heard, and hats off to you, my friend. I have mostly do talking about advocacy, but I've also written about it extensively. And since I started in the clinical research arena, I was proud to be asked to write a chapter for one of the major, I'm told, major textbooks for clinical researchers, and it's about the public context of science, which too many people forget about. They think, well, we're just doing, I'm doing science, I'm doing science, I'm doing science, and I'll be recognized or not eventually by other scientists. And they forget who's paying the bill, who ultimately benefits. It's those taxpayers one way or another. So there is an important public context. Claire mentioned a few things that I did early on, which we don't have to go through again. But these were the years when I was doing those things. It was in San Francisco. And what was going on in San Francisco? The HIV/AIDS epidemic was roaring. And I watched and was gratefully part of not only the science that was going on in San Francisco, including at our institute at the time, but also the public advocacy for it. And it really was the public advocates, the patients, the caregivers, folks associated with them who changed everything, who drove more money for science for HIV/AIDS, who chained themselves famously to the chain link fence outside the FDA at the time, did a lot of other things. And by the way, Tony Fauci was a true hero then and now. But you can see the difference it made. It wasn't scientists driving that difference. It came on board, but they didn't start it and they didn't drive it. It was patients. And that's a really important message here, that scientists can and do change the image of what's to come, a phrase you'll see again. But in partnership with patients, it's just a lot more powerful. Another example that I've personally been part of is women's health research, raising the profile, being there to help create the Office of Women's Health Research at NIH, proudly so. I came from that clinical trial called the Multiple Risk Factor Intervention Trial, aka Mr. Fit. When we recruited patients for that, and only men who were eligible, we were told, I was a very junior person, barely, out of grade school, we were told that anything that was discovered that in men would apply to women. That was absurd. It was absurd on the face of it, but I trained people who were the recruiters to say that. And we all believed it, by the way, at the time. It was nuts. Think of other things we all believed. You could actually have smoking and non-smoking sections on an airplane. Well, that makes perfect sense, right? So things that seem obvious change. And they change because of science, and they change because people push for change. And this is another example of patients, not scientists, pushing for change, but aligning the science community ultimately and driving tremendous change. And there's room for much more of this, and there's a history before it as well. But I'll just give you those two examples. You heard about our mission. It's not a slow-paced mission. It's audacious, it's big, and that's why we love it. It turns out that some of the challenges we are facing today, had their kind of earlier moment in the late 80s. This is from the charter of ResearchAmerica. Congress, the administration, preoccupied with deficit reduction, which they are now, after revving up the deficit. Now they're preoccupied with it again, et cetera. Not paying attention to prioritizing science, in short. So in some ways, what goes around comes around, almost 30 years ago now. But the people who founded ResearchAmerica, who included Mary Lasker, could see that it was time for an organization and a dedicated effort to change the image of what's to come. I was fortunate to know Mary Lasker. It was at the end of her career, really the beginning of mine as an advocate, but she gave me a lot of tips and clues. Some of them was just, things I should know as a woman leader. Oh, that's like a gift. And she was a powerful one. And we use this quote on one of our advocacy tools, which is about research saving lives and saving money. And we're proud of that, and we never forget about Mary Lasker. Who's a member of Research America? Claire mentioned is true. It's an alliance. Many universities that you may have graduated from or work in, have worked in, will work in, are our members. So are patient groups. Remember how important patient groups are. Scientific societies and industry that is absolutely essential to the development and delivery of the actual solutions that are going to change lives, save lives, and change lives. And you can read about that. We have a wonderful board, et cetera. What happens when advocacy works? Well, here's some of the big payoffs, if you will, for NIH specifically. Now, we also do a lot of advocacy for FDA, CDC, ARC, NSF, and some work in the broader science community because it's increasingly important to stand shoulder to shoulder. Science is standing shoulder to shoulder. So you can read about those. We're excited about the recent bipartisan budget agreement that was hard fought for. And this is a shot of an ad that we did with the broader science community. It was our initiative. Here inside the Beltway publications, also some major publications, regional editions, the Wall Street Journal, a few others that you may or may not have ever heard of, but they make a difference inside the Beltway, plus social media. But the point was, science opens this world of possibilities. It's the aspirational kind of goal. And it was to drive raising the caps, as it says there. But there's a second part, which is now that there's more money to spend, let's spend a healthy proportion of that on science. And that's what we're working on right now. And I encourage you can work on this. It doesn't matter where you are currently located. #FundScience, #FundScience is the way to speak up about the importance in current budget negotiations of more resources for the work you do, the work your colleagues do, and the difference it could make. And you can send that directly to your elected representative using their own hashtag, their own locators at Senator Hassan. I talked to Hannah about, where's Hannah? So great to talk to Hannah, yes. Read about this very inside stuff about how the sausage is made. So to graph it out here, we know that we have an administration that's not particularly interested in ramping up funding support for NIH or other science agencies. But in truth, we've had other administrations like that. And the president's budget traditionally is dead on arrival. It's the Congress that makes the decisions on how taxpayer dollars are spent. But the truly depressing part of this, I don't know if this is going to work, of this graph is this dotted line going down, constant dollars controlled for inflation. We have not seen a major increase in NIH funding in a solidly uphill way since the doubling, which is now almost 20 years ago. I personally think it's time to do that again. I think the case is there. I think the public would support it. But I'm not here to say we've released some new campaign, because we're not quite ready yet. But we're optimistic, and NIH is going to do okay in both this year and next year. But okay is not the same as taking advantage of true scientific opportunity. That's the goal. That's the level of support that we're after, not inflation plus 2% or something like that. Taking advantage of scientific opportunity to meet public needs. This is more inside detail, if you will, about what to expect and what's happening right now, but I think I kind of covered that conceptually anyway. That's still not working. No, that was backwards. I thought so. Okay. So I talked about changing the image of things to come. This is a very regular line, speaking point from our former chairman, John Porter, who's now our chair emeritus, for whom there is a building named at NIH, you may be aware, a large one, who was in the House when he was the lead in the House when the NIH budget was doubled. And after he left the Congress, he joined our board and became chairman. He was a wonderful, spectacular leader for research and received the Lasker Award for public impact, public service in the 90s, I think, maybe early 2000. Well deserved. That's just not going to work. Okay. If you're interested, this is on our website, some of the things that he regularly says to groups and nice pointers for talking to members of Congress. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the public opinion data that we commission surveys of the public on a regular basis to kind of keep a finger on the pulse of what the American public is thinking about, look at trends over time, try to help us as advocates and our members, a very broad group, be more in touch with, really understand the audience of who we're trying to persuade, who we're talking to change their hearts and minds or reinforce what they already say they support, science, let's say, and get them to do something about it, to speak out themselves. So when you're looking at public opinion data, you should always do what members of Congress and their staff do. You instantly combine in your head anything that has to do with important, very, and somewhat, and the flip side of that. Not at all, or definitely not important. You just combine those categories. It's a top line look at opinion, but if you don't combine them, you can distract yourself from how political actors think about survey data. So this is pretty overwhelming once you think about it that way, that the public thinks that it's important for scientists to, that's you, informing elected officials. Overwhelmingly important. And to inform the public. How to do that, I'll get into how to do either of those. But just overwhelming public demand, if you will. How about this? This is like, wow, I think. Do you agree or disagree that public policies should be based on the best available scientists? Well, the American public agrees, despite anecdotal evidence to the contrary, despite the facts on the ground in many cases. And it's not a political party difference. That's really important to know. And it's not just about medical and health research. Remember to combine strongly agree and somewhat agree here. Overwhelmingly, let's get scientists playing a role in shaping policy for everything on this list. Energy. Not going on right now. Defense. Anyway, you can read the rest. But this is meant to be empowering to you. We frankly didn't know. This is a new question for us. We didn't know how it was going to come out. But it's quite reinforcing. And a few more. How important is it that those elected officials listen to advice for scientists? It's increased in a way that we rarely see. We've been commissioning these surveys for over 25 years. We know what to expect. We rarely see big jumps in either direction. 14% increase over not quite 2.5 years. That's astonishing. So if you think the public isn't paying attention or doesn't care, they are. This is our current chair, former governor, former congressman, Mike Castle, moderate Republican, who was instrumental in assuring that stem cell research could go forward in the first part of this century. It's funny to say it that way. And still is passionately committed to assuring that stem cell research goes forward. And I just think it's just like a blessing that he's in this place as our chairman right now, while there are clearly new threats to stem cell research. And he is on top of that and passionately committed. Now, I mentioned that John Porter has a building named for him, but I love to show this slide because you're aware, having either now working on or visited the NIH campus, that there are a number of buildings named for people, whoever they are, whether you know or don't know. Well, they're former members of Congress, senators and members of the House, And you can see who they are here. You can see that they're not all one party or the other. This is hugely important. It's always been a bipartisan commitment by the Congress to fund the NIH. I think there should, and I've talked to Francis about this, I said you should be setting aside ground now for the next 2 buildings on the NIH campus, because I think we've got people with a commitment to NIH at the legacy level serving in the Congress right now whose names ought to be on this plan here. I've also told those members of Congress that's what we see in them. That's what we see in them. This is one of those bold aspirational things. Why not? But they would deserve it, and they are these gentlemen. Senator Blunt from Missouri and Mr. Cole from Oklahoma. Now, they're both Republicans. They make NIH one of their absolutely top issues. And they are from, if you will, red states. They aren't necessarily who you would think or who most scientists think are our best champions in the Congress right now, but they are. They're not just good, they're excellent. Their predecessors in both those jobs were not so good. I don't mean they're bad people. They just didn't have NIH as one of their legacy issues. So stay tuned, and if you are from that state, if you have family in that state, and even if you aren't, say thank you to them. Works on social media, takes 30 seconds. So now we get you involved. Starbucks test. So imagine yourself in a Starbucks in the United States. Let me be clear about that. In the place where you vote, the location, not here in Bethesda, but where you're from, where you're registered to vote. And I certainly hope you are all registered to vote. All right, so there you are, you're in Starbucks, and you're getting a cup of coffee. And your member of Congress is there also getting a cup of coffee. So raise your hand if you recognize that person by sight. Hey, this is pretty good. Okay. Now, second question. If you're a member of Congress, I'm not talking about senators here, they're easier to recognize. Anybody want to change their hand? Right. But anyway, now, raise your hand if your representative recognizes you by sight. Maybe, okay. This is the problem, you've just demonstrated it, and in case you feel like outliers, no, you are the norm. This is the definition of the problem. You are invisible to your member of Congress. You are that person's constituent. Do you think that member of Congress knows other people in Starbucks by sight? You bet she does, he does. You bet. Because among other things that those other people in Starbucks or other places in the community have in mind, it is very important for their member of Congress to know who they are and what they're doing for other constituents, other people in the community. You can place a face on science, a face on research that a member of Congress can recognize. They tell us all the time, members of Congress, that when they're out in their, whether it's their state, if they're a senator or their district, nobody ever talks to them about science. And some of them say, I don't think there's any scientists in my district. They're wrong. There are scientists in every district. But you get the idea, right? Okay. So what is it that you have in common with an elected official? Maybe you hate their positions on pretty much everything, but you do have something in common with them. And that is that you serve the public's interest. That is how an elected representative, whether to Congress or the state legislature or anything else, frames what they're all about. I'm serving the public's interest. That is, in fact, what you do, too. And by the way, you're probably using public dollars, or at least some amount of public dollars. That's what you have in common. That's how you start the conversation. It does help to know what that person looks like. And you could be wrong. You could go up to someone and it's not your member, but that's all right. Forgetting that for a moment. You can read the rest. It does help to be ready with an ask. But again, this isn't memorizing a script. Not memorizing a script. It's creating that common interest, like you. I serve the public's interest. They are going to ask you what you do at that point. They want your vote. That's why they're going to ask you that. And you will tell them briefly, but not, I'll get to how you might tell them, but here's some possible asks that, you, as I say, you don't have to remember a lot here. Pretty simple things. And if you don't know really what those are all about, check out our website and say thank you. Thank you for their public service. They should be thanking you, and they will if you say it. Thank you for your public service. They'll say the same thing back to you because you've identified the fact that you serve the public's interest. That'll feel good. So I'm talking about interacting with the public, members of Congress interacting with the public. The president who created the National Academy of Sciences was Abraham Lincoln. He also had a pretty keen understanding of the importance of what we call public opinion, public sentiment. And these are real words to live by at ResearchAmerica. This is why we commission surveys. I mentioned them. We've been doing this for a long time. Standard methodology for public opinion surveys in a political context. Here's a depressing piece of news. Again, with a big swing. A 12% decrease in those saying the United States was going to be the #1 world leader in science and technology in 2020. In case you think the American public isn't paying attention to what is actually going on, you're wrong. They are paying attention. China is on a path to pass the United States, already are in publications, scientific publications, just happened a couple months ago. And it's a declared goal of the government to fund science in a way that they will surpass the United States as a leader. I'm not opposed to China doing more and more wonderful science because ultimately I trust it will benefit us all. But why are we standing on the sidelines with that declining level of support? Similarly, huge decrease in percentages who say the United States will be considered the #1 world leader in healthcare in 2020. Many would argue that we're not now the world leader. But again, the public is aware of this and doesn't like it. It is important that the US be a global leader. Combine very important and somewhat important. Clinical trials, because that's where I came from, I love it. Kind of mixed report in our survey data. Some good news, some bad news. We track this very carefully, and we do it in a way that we can segment out different populations because of well-known challenges in recruitment and retention in clinical trials. But the really good news is the willingness at huge levels to share personal health information. I think about the NIH all-in kind of campaign. I can't remember the name of it right now, going on right now. This is very, very promising and really should be bottled and almost commercialized. We're going to change things here, including the standard of medical care, healthcare, to include talking about research, including clinical research, which is what this is on. That would make a huge difference. We are also got a finger on the pulse of in-the-moment issues. Opioids, we've been doing a lot of work on that. Conducting research, the importance of conducting research on what we call social determinants of health. That is not a term of normal conversation in Starbucks or anyplace else, but getting at the point here, the public supports it, it's not what we're doing. We, the people, as our policymakers, listening to us and doing what we need to do. Now this data is not ours, but it's part of a new publication from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which I commend to you. It just came out a couple weeks ago. That publication includes some of our data, but also NORC, University of Chicago survey group of longstanding, and also Pew data and Science Counts and others. So you can see, I hope, that the percentage of adults with a great deal of confidence, so this is an example of a great deal, this is the extreme, the high end, not just confidence, but a great deal of confidence in the leaders of science, has remained robust and still is strong. That is not the same as saying that people are confident in the institutions of science, i.e. universities, because we've recently seen some survey data that is going down rapidly in a scary way. But conflating confidence in people with declining confidence in institutions is a terrible mistake, which we've got to be careful about. But this is positive information here, confidence, and you saw a lot of other indicators of confidence. Despite all that, and to illustrate the Starbucks point, scientists are invisible in our society. So the question in the survey is, can you give me the name of a living scientist? Now it's broad. It's not medical and health research. Can you give me the name of a living scientist? We've been asking this question for 20 years. We get the same response, percentage-wise, for 20 years. It's not getting better. The names have changed a little bit. Actually, Stephen Hawking's been on the list for 20 years. But some of the other names have changed up. And then there's a whole bunch of dead scientists named, but that's not really the point. The point is the 84% who can't name a living scientist. Very depressing. Okay, easier question. Can you give me the name of a place, any place, where medical or health research is conducted? Now we're switching to medical and health research. Okay? You probably have an inkling that's not going to be good news. You're right. You're right. 2/3 of Americans cannot. They don't even guess and guess wrong. There's some of that in the full data. But you can see here the power of national branding with gigantic sums of money behind it, I might add. But this is the problem, 66%. And it hasn't changed for 20 years. Hasn't changed. That's, by the way, not our fault that it hasn't changed. But we're sensitive to this as a meaningful kind of metric or biomarker, if you will, for what's not happening yet in the science community, which is truly engaging the non-science public. This has political relevance that's overwhelming. To the best of your knowledge, would you say that medical research in the US is conducted in all 50 states, which indeed it is? Only a quarter of people say yes. And you think about, well, each of those states has 2 senators, right? And numbers of members of the House who, frankly, never hear, I told you this already, never hear about research when they're in their district, and in fact may not even know, depending on what the state is, that there's science going on here in their state, or that anyone cares about it. Big problem. So the challenge is to increase visibility and thinking about what can you do. First thing you can do is self-identify as a scientist. Instead of avoiding conversations with people who say, so what do you do? Avoiding that by changing the topic because you don't want to have one more going nowhere, eye-rolling conversation with somebody about your work. And we've all had those. Some other ideas here. But this, don't outsource advocacy. If you depend on ResearchAmerica and other advocates to do it all for you, all I can say is we can do what we can do, and we're proud of what we've accomplished, but it's not enough. It's not enough. One of the things that everybody's had an experience of is skepticism, or you can even say worse, from somebody you've talked to about what you do or about science broadly. And it could go to, Wait a minute, you're in science, okay. You know, one day red wine is good for you. The next day it's not good for you. What's this new diet study that we're just hearing about these all the time? That's just the food, the easy stuff. When are we actually going to cure cancer? I'm not feeling good about stem cell research. Okay. If you, instead of trying to, okay, this is complicated, let me explain to you. Let's back up here. I'm going to make you as smart as I am on this topic. Don't do that. Say, you sound skeptical. You're thinking like a scientist. I was trained to be skeptical, to ask questions. We don't know the answer to everything yet. You're going to have a completely different conversation if you start that way. Sort of the martial arts approach to a difficult question. You turn it around. Embrace skepticism. You do that already. You were trained to do that. Now just transfer it to those tough conversations, or used to be tough conversations. There's robust data to back the reality that you can't use facts to change feelings. Clobbering people with data will not work, and in fact, it will probably hurt. Just reinforces the elitist, patronizing nature of the science community. I'm talking about in the minds of people whose last science course was in high school and they hated it. So you have to build a narrative that's in the 10% content that people retain and use, and it has to be about them, not about you. It has to be about their story, not your story. But fortunately, those things overlap. They overlap in ways that are mostly about aspiration, of finding solutions. It is about social media, among other things. It is definitely not about data. We use this frame of communication called then, now, and imagine. Anybody can do this. You don't have to go to a special workshop. Just think about your own work and how it fits into this kind of frame. The frame basically goes, then, back in the old days, it could be diabetes, it could be HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS was a death sentence then, back in the old days. Now, thanks to our nation's commitment to medical research, people with diabetes, people with HIV/AIDS can live a full and healthy life. And we have a goal to eventually, sooner rather than later, imagine putting diabetes, putting HIV/AIDS in the history books. It could be cancer, it could be anything. This is the way to take people through very quickly in phrases, not in paragraphs about each. Just then, now, and imagine. Connect to a shared goal. And make sure you find the place to say what research is doing and that you, the taxpayer, have helped make this happen. Thank you. And we've got more to do together. Sometimes money comes up. Why are we spending all this money, $34 billion, maybe 35 coming up, whatever, on NIH? Well, it's a compared to what question is really, it's a lot of money. It should be spent well. We should take seriously people who question the use of that money. They're being skeptical. That's fair. But it's also sometimes useful to compare it to other things. Other things that we spend consumer dollars on helps people understand that this is a very wealthy nation. Not every individual is wealthy, but the nation is wealthy. So this is an in-the-moment Academy Awards coming up. Sunday night, people are going to be talking about it, right? Do you realize how much money people spend at the box office? I'm a movie lover myself. Okay, $11 billion. Well, here's what you can buy at NIH for $11 billion. Just, once you get the idea of this, you can compare it to anything. How much does a Super Bowl ad cost? How much do we spend on St. Patrick's Day? I know all these things. We spend more on cut flowers than we do on cancer research every year. There's just tons of examples. How about defense? So, most important thing is not to say, let's spend less money on defense. It's a losing argument politically, and a losing argument with most of the public. But we could have a nation worth defending. There's a lot to be said about that. A nation that's well educated, a nation that has a great infrastructure, a nation that makes science a priority. A nation worth defending. Don't take on defense per se. It doesn't work. Been there. Quickly learned, moved on. But this is another interesting way to talk about big money, lots of money. So how much is that budget for X, NIH, FDA, read it, defense, per person per year, per member of the US population? Not much, turns out, not much. Just about $100 for research into every disease you can think of, A to Z, autism to Zika, everything in between, rare diseases. People are stunned by this. They say, that's all? They forget about, is $35 billion roughly too much money? That's, come on, let's put it in some kind of context. So what I'm driving at is context really matters. And don't get distracted by people who are worried about dollars, even if they're members of Congress who can so easily, the skilled staffer is typical of this, so easily get a scientist or an advocate into a conversation about, my boss agrees completely with everything you say, loves medical research, whatever it is you're pitching. What would you recommend that we not fund so we can do that? It's a trap. You don't have to answer that question. You say, that's your job, your boss's job, not mine. I'm here to make the case for spending money for medical research, and I know that the public supports that. And we've got tons more data that can help you make that case. But you can make it yourself. So to recap, how to think about talking to non-scientists. So the people who aren't science trained, first of all, never call them or refer to them as lay people. You laugh, but I bet you've done it. It's so easy to fall into that lay people. There's the smart, knowledgeable, in charge people, the scientists, or think of a different construct. That means religious leader. People do not like this when they are cast into the lay audience. But they don't want it from a scientist. They may want it from a religious leader, but you're not a religious leader, so don't use that word. So think of them as non-science trained. They're different than you are, but they're you. They have the same aspirations. We can tell you more about any aspect of this and would be delighted to, because that's our job. Put a face on research, your own. Don't shy from self-identifying. But there are 4 words that are just the key to that conversation that might change the way you communicate in future, not just with members of Congress, but with your Uncle Matt, who is one of the difficult, maybe, people in your family, your extended family, who's always saying things at the Thanksgiving dinner table or wherever. What is it you do again? In this clearly not going to be a good conversation way. And if you say, you're going to have a different conversation with Uncle Matt if you say, I work for you. Now, he might say, would you like to go out and wash the car? Or some, ha-ha stuff, But he absolutely has never heard that from you. And it can lead, we know from testimonials, we get these all the time, week in, week out, my colleagues and I, from people who have actually tried this out for the first time and talked about how it completely changed their conversation about their own scientific career with a member of their family or someone else that is close to them, or a stranger. Works with strangers, too. You can use it on an airplane. I recommend near the end of the flight, because you don't want to be talking the whole time with a stranger. But you can get into this conversation by saying, are you oh, we're landing now, are you going home, or are you going to visit or something, and they'll tell you what they're doing. Then they're going to say, what do you do? And this is what you say. Try it. And really, we've had people tell us that the conversation on an airplane with a stranger led to that person endowing a position at the university. And that was in coach, not first class. And we've had people say that the stranger they were talking to said, I had no idea how all this worked. My tax dollars go to NIH, no idea. Got up a petition and they were the head of a real estate agent, got all the realtors to sign on to it, sent it to their senator. All kinds of good things can happen. Try it if you like it. I'm very fortunate, and as are my colleagues at ResearchAmerica, is that we work for you. And we love doing it, so thank you.
And now we have a few moments for questions, and we have an esteemed colleague to lead the Q&A period.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was incredible. Yeah, I guess we can. I'll be handing out if anyone has any questions. Yeah, that was very inspiring. That was great. I love that talk. Does anyone else have any questions that you would? I see some hands up already in the back there.
But while you're thinking of your question, Dr. Scheer, do you want to say anything at this point?
No, I was supposed to introduce Juan Pablo, but that's fine.
Oh, sorry.
But he's Juan Pablo and he's great, right? Okay, we continue.
Thank you.
Stem cell
Anyway,
researcher.
He's very interested in scientific advocacy.
I am,
And
yes.
it's very appropriate to lead this discussion.
Thank
Okay.
you, Juan.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk. I guess my first question is, how many questions can I ask? Because I have 4, but should I start with?
Let's do one and
One?
let other people
All right,
go,
all right,
and
all
then
right,
you
all
can
right.
ask others if no one
We
else.
can circle
Yeah.
back. All
Yeah.
right. So you mentioned these kind of, I hesitate to call them hot topics, but HIV/AIDS and breast cancer, like these topics that public sentiment, like there's a lot of public sentiment for, and that drives funding for them. I wonder if there's any way that we can kind of spread that out. Is it always like one topic that's really urgent at the time, or it seems like there should be a way that we can generalize, like prioritizing science funding in general rather than something that's just an epidemic at the time, or wondering your thoughts on that. Also, I was very surprised to see that these statistics you showed over the past 20 years for where research is done, et cetera, hadn't changed over those 20 years with social media and stuff being so prevalent now. So is that a surprise to you guys as well? Sorry, I snuck in 2 questions. I didn't mean to.
You broke the rule already. So the first one, can we achieve the same kind of stunning success for science overall? The answer is yes, we did that for doubling the NIH budget. That's absolutely what happened. And all the patient groups, huge number, scientific societies, universities, industry were all behind that. It took years to get them all behind it, I might add, but it happened. And I do think it could happen again. There are some similar things in our society, including a strong economy right now, and awareness of real problems, opioids right now, mental health generally, failure to end Alzheimer's, you can add to the list, that are highly relevant to a lot of people. So I think there's a case for that, for science overall. But there's nothing wrong with the push by individual disease groups or whatever. Those are to be welcomed, not run away from. There's very little to know. I would have to say there's probably a little bit of evidence that those pushes result in other science getting less funding. It's very hard to find examples of that. People think that's what happens, but it turns out to be add-ons, not takeaways. And we've got to be careful about robbing Peter to pay Paul. And we try to stop that in its tracks anytime it does happen. So what about failed, why aren't we seeing increases in awareness of where science is conducted, for example? I think that's because the science community thinks that's what we're doing, but we're not. We think that everybody who drives by a giant university that's located close to them or not close to them knows that research is being conducted there. They do not, trust me. And I'll give you an example of it from the former chancellor of the University of Nebraska Medical Center, who heard me say that some years ago. And because they were constructing a new research building, he took a gamble and he put on top of this research building, which is on a hill in Nebraska, in Omaha, but it was up high a little bit. On the top of the building, in letters 10 feet high in red, was the word research. And then he waited. It's a big risk for him, actually, Hal Maher. And he said that he was overwhelmed. The people that he'd known for years in the community, socially and for business reasons, came up to him and said, "You mean you do research there? I didn't know that." I mean, truly. He said it happened all the time. And yet, all those little signs down low, the Claire Pomeroy Research Building, or the Institute, nobody was really noticing that 10-foot high word research changed a lot of things. But that's a metaphor, I think, for what we think we're doing, whether it's on social media or otherwise, or in reports that are issued by various universities or something. They're not necessarily hitting the sweet spot on this. And all I can tell you is I've had 20 years of evidence to show that it's not working, whatever you're doing.
Yeah, I guess we'll go in the front here. Oh, you got it.
Thanks very much for a really cool talk. I think one of your slides showed this really nice kind of figure that showed the percentage of people who trust scientists is really constant over time. But it was still only about I think 40%, which implies that the majority of people still don't trust scientists.
Well,
so I was wondering whether you might have any ideas of how to kind of concretely make progress in advocating for science with people, the majority of whom don't trust scientists.
I think you're misreading that data. We could go back to it. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, and I didn't make enough of a point of that, obviously. Let me just see if I can pick it up on the sorter.
Do you want me to try to find it?
Yeah, thank you. So it was the percentage who have great confidence. So it was actually not, if we were showing our data, our version of that, we would have had the great and some. It would have been much higher, and it is much higher. So you shouldn't worry about the 40%. The purpose, I think, served, and it's a good catch because I'm going to change that in the next presentation we put together, because the purpose really is to show in comparison to the others. But your observation about it, which turns out isn't exactly right, certainly would be a legitimate takeaway. So I got to fix that so it speaks for itself. That scientists, when you combine great amount of confidence and confidence, it's way high, and it hasn't gone down. I don't know what it is exactly, but 70, 80%.
But can you speak to how you talk to people who don't trust you, whatever the percentage is? Because there are some. There's an that's a separate question and a good one. There is an intractable percentage that you are not going to convince to change their mind. And I like to speculate that there's some basis for this in survey data that's about 10%. But it is definitely not science overall that we're talking about. It's specific kinds of science. Matt Bailey here can tell you about the resistance of some people, and I think it's a really intractable percentage, that resist animal research of any kind, any place. I've had some experience that in my former life with people calling me up in furious anger because they found out that we were doing animal research in our institution and threatening all kinds of things. And I've
had some practice in doing this, but I, would say things like, well, we are, among other things, here in this medical center, we do open heart surgery, and we do research with animals to be sure we're ready to do this with people, and does that change your thinking? No, was the response. We should be experimenting on prisoners. Anyway, you get the idea. And to which, there's your own moral stance and your values, and you're not going to change that person's mind, let's face it. And there's many other, Matt does this much more often than I do, talk about animal research, but I did it on a regular basis when I was heading a research institute, and you learn how to be more effective, but you are not going to convince everybody. There's another, I remember now, there's another conversation that sometimes you have to pick your spots on this, but we could have everybody who resists all animal research wear a special ID bracelet, what I'm talking about, like if you're diabetic and stuff, that says, if I need emergency care, I want no care that has involved the use of animals in research. And see who's willing to take that little bet for consistency. But that's not something you just throw out casually. Don't throw that out casually. It's, now there's other research that people are quite unwilling to change their minds about, and some of it's not in the medical and health space, but vaccine deniers is another hot one right now. And I think that the medical provider, the physician, is key here, as much as the research community. But again, one can learn a few things about how to have that conversation too. Yep.
We've got time for maybe two more. You've had your
I'll
hand
try to
up for
briefer
most of the
too.
beginning, yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. I really like the then, now, imagine framework, but
Thank
when I
you.
think about my own field, neuroscience and mental health,
Yes.
I sometimes worry that people overpromising on the imagine may be contributing to some of the loss in confidence in scientific institutions. And related to that, when I think about myself in Starbucks, one of the sort of biggest anxieties is the question, what are you doing that's going to help now? And some fields of science, neuroscience being a good example, are just so
Right.
tricky that it's difficult to go from basic advance to sort of immediate practical insight. And that's be great to get your thoughts on how to convince someone in Starbucks.
Right. So there actually is no data that I'm aware of that indicates that the American public has turned against scientists for failure to deliver on a big promise. It's very much, it's talked about, there's anecdote about this all over the place, but there's no data that says we have lost faith, trust in science because they haven't delivered on some goal that most people never heard was a goal to begin with. Truly. People are in a hurry, but they like it that scientists have big goals. They have that imagined goal, that aspirational goal. Put it in the history books. Done. Defeated. That's a good goal to have. Now, if they want you to commit to a date certain that will happen, I can't do that. We couldn't do it to get to the level of progress we've come to so far. And frankly, we're not able to do it now, but we are working on it. Every day. And some of those experiments are dry holes. Not everything succeeds. If we already knew the answer, you can go on with the whole thing. But it's not an engineering challenge. Engineering challenge is a little different. And sometimes distinguishing that for people, let's go to the moon, is different than curing cancer or Alzheimer's or any number. So I would not, I constantly say to the science community, don't worry about that imagined goal. People aren't going to take you on that one, in our experience.
We've got time for maybe one more question. Before dinner.
So my question is somewhat related to the last question, and it kind of gets at something that I think about a lot when I present what my research is to the public is I'm a cell biologist. I'm not at all a clinician, and sometimes I know that if I make the sometimes tenuous connection the medical benefits of my research, that will resonate more with people.
You're right.
But I'm doing very basic research, and sometimes that gives people the wrong impression, even though I know that it'll excite them more, it'll make it resonate more. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that even if it's a long stretch, we should go for the argument always that basic science will eventually support medical research, even though I'm not doing that? Do you think it's a lost cause to say science for the sake of science because someone who's paying tax dollars for that doesn't want to hear that, even if you're a scientist that does science for that reason?
Yeah, if I only had to choose one thing to say, I would not use science for the sake of science. It's, it goes to that, why would I pay you to, do things that you're curious about? That often comes up too. The importance of scientific curiosity. Don't lead with that in any case. Do not. Because most people don't have the opportunity to get paid to do what they're curious about. Let's face it, it's just not the right word right now. Conceptually, you can get to it, but I really do strongly feel you should start out at the aspirational goal. And there's a famous, sometimes used a slide from an example of a Nobel laureate who's, before I'm finished, I'll think of the name, who received a Nobel Prize for, like many, for very basic science, and whose sister is a journalist, and who wrote in the New York Times that she spent her whole life, it was Eric Kandel, no, it wasn't Eric Kandel, it was somebody else, Paul Greengard, thank you, whose sister spent her whole life, she reported in this article, asking her brother what he did, and after a while giving up. Had no idea what he was doing. She knew he was a famous scientist. She had absolutely no idea. And she was intellectually curious. It's her sibling getting nowhere. So she said it took the Nobel Prize, by then we have websites and things, and their publicity, their release, to help her understand that what her brother was doing might one day help solve Alzheimer's, cure Alzheimer's. Those are the key words. Might one day help or contribute to finding the answer to fill in the blank. That's all it took. And then she understood what he was doing. Why are those words so hard to say? So if you can't go straight to imagine curing history, put it in the history book, you can say, I'm hoping that my work might one day lead to, and what people actually hear is the end point. And you've taken care of protecting your don't want to overpromise piece. And if you are successful in engaging them for longer, they might ask you what you mean by that. And then you can explain that. But I'm told now that the term basic is so demeaned it doesn't mean what it used to, especially in the general jargon, lexicon of young people today. Basic is not a positive thing. Oh, Mom, that's so basic.
But fundamentals.
Fundamentals good. Discovery is even better. Discovery is great. Yeah. Fundamentals okay too. Yeah.
And does everybody know the end story of Paul Greengard, what he did?
The end story.
Paul Greengard, you should all know, used his Nobel Prize money to establish the Greengard Award, which is given to a leading woman scientist every year for an incredible breakthrough. So, and he did it to honor his mother who died in childbirth, giving birth to him.
Whoa. It's even more poignant. I actually didn't know that.
So sometimes telling the story of
Yes, the stories are always good.
is very important.
Scientists as people. So I think we're ready to eat, right?
I'm being told we've got time for one more?
One more.
Was that it? Or
One more, right here.
okay, so one quick one.
And I'll have a quick response.
Okay. So does anyone else have a quick one? Okay, so we've got maybe a quick one, and then maybe you can.
You can talk to me, please.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear.
Just wanted to comment or ask you a question about some of the slides you were showing about China. And
Yeah.
I'm almost old enough to remember the Sputnik era when the threat of
Right.
Soviet kind of spooked our leaders into being motivated.
Right.
Do you think, particularly given the current administration where being bigger and better seems to be an important thing, do you think those kind of arguments might have influence?
Hard to answer. See, that's supposed to be a quick question, but the answer is I'm not so sure. I don't see it as akin to Sputnik. I definitely do remember that. I'm old enough to remember that. It's not quite the same, It's not existential. It's about losing global leadership. And let's face it, this country has lost global leadership on many things. Used to be that no one believed, I mean, there's literature on this, no one believed that the US would stop being the car manufacturer giant of the world. Oops. How about consumer electronics? Field my father had a business in, everybody thought that was, the US destiny forever. We're always going to be the world leader. Nope. So it could be happening in science too. I think the China argument is potent and important and works in a lot of settings, not all, however. But to think that the public isn't aware of that is a mistake. And I think that's the real value here.
So let's thank Juan for leading an excellent Q&A.
You told me something too.
For a really inspiring talk.
My pleasure.